Dr. Miller with the short journal club here. I have this little article that I thought was interesting. It ties into other research. It's not a perfect study. It's a small study. Like, oh, man, you're selling me on it. Stop, please. But when you're accumulating understanding of something, you should take in your experiences do matter. Some voices from experts, right? Those are kind of lower levels of what we consider evidence, which I think a lot of times is misplaced. It should be a little higher up sometimes. We'll argue about that later. But when it comes to gathering information, getting a complete picture, having multiple research studies, I think is valuable. And so I found this little study. It's, again, very small, very simple. It just kind of, to me, throws another gold coin on the pile, all right, of supporting this idea that if you're into Olympic-style weightlifting and in general in training, but certainly if you're in Olympic-style weightlifting, that accessory work does matter. That a lot of times we focus on technique of the Olympic-style movements, the snatch and clean and jerk, which I think is important. There's no doubt about it. And I'm reading through the Glenn Penley method. I'll review that book shortly when I finish it. But we focus so much on technique that a lot of times we forget what the sport is all about. You got to lift heavy weights. And so I found this little study. It comes across a feed that I guess subscribe to, if you want to think of it that way. And every once in a while I get these little studies. A lot of them are in smaller journals. And so, that usually happens with smaller studies as they don't get published in the big journals. One was in the International Journal of Physiology, Nutrition, and Physical Education. It was a study from a couple Indian researchers, and I mentioned that because some of the language in the article at times can be a little bit choppy, but I don't think it's. I've seen a lot of studies from other countries that are hard to read, and then I don't really trust the data because I don't understand maybe what's being conveyed. This one does not have that issue. So I'm confident in the data that was put here. Now, it has some problems with it, like every study, and some of these are glaring in this study. It's missing the body weight of the population that's in the study, the sample size of the sample in the study. So we don't know that, and you're like, well, why are you reporting a study that doesn't even report the demographics of the actual people who participated, at least in terms of body weight? Because it still has some, again, there's nuggets that I think are cool. There's some information in the study I think will translate well in light of the other research that's out there and experience as a coach and as an athlete. So take it for what it's worth. I'm putting those disclaimers up front. I'm not saying this is a perfect, again, there isn't one. Anyway, it's not a clinical control. It's a correlation study. I just found it interesting. Maybe you will find it too. If you don't worry about it. By the way, if you like my channel, be sure to subscribe to it and like this video at the end of it if you think it's really cool. I do have a book out, Foundational Weight Training. You can check it out in the video description. But certainly, share my page as well. I'm up over 100 videos of different topics, different book reviews, journal clubs like this one, topical stuff being like rate of force development, and joint by joint approach, and things like concepts like these, and size, principle, motor, and recruitment that might be helpful to you or somebody that is in your world, all right, of coaching or friends, a lift, or whatever it might be. Okay, so let's get into this. This study was called the Analyses of the Relationship Between Triceps, Biceps, Pectoralis, and Scapular Muscles Strength with Olympic Weightlifting Skills. Okay, a very simple study. Took 100 males that were college age that looked like they competed in the weightlifting in some capacity. The average snatch of the group was 94.56 kilos, standard deviation of 22. The clean and jerk was 120 point. I'm going to round up to 120.1 or 121. Let's round up to that. Average around standard deviation around 28. So a pretty good spread there. And we don't know the body weight, so I'm going to assume here, and you can say no, you shouldn't do that. Fine, I'm just going to do it anyway, and you can just discard this if you don't think so. I'm going to assume though the average body weight is probably falling in line. If the average body weight in like research is 70 kilos, I imagine this group is probably a little bigger. Maybe we could say 80 kilos. Let's just totally skew the study in the wrong way. We'll say 94 kilos, which is they're snatching their body weight. All right, so let's assume the worst, that they're average, very average weightlifters, and they're snatching their body weight. And likely they're a little bit better than that. Some pretty big clean and jerks, and when you look at clean and jerk numbers, and when you look at the actual data plotted. All right, and then they took these individuals supposedly under the supervision of a qualified individual, fitness individual, and then tested their bench press and their overhead press, what they call the overhead front press. Okay, and then the average bench was 88 kilo, and the average overhead press plus or minus around 12 kilos. Average overhead press was 75 kilos plus or minus 12, and then they just correlated. the snatch, clean and jerk with these two accessory lifts. Okay. The correlation values, if you're familiar, 0 is no correlation, 1 is a perfect correlation. The correlation between the bench press and the snatch was 0.83 and the clean and jerk was 0.5. The correlation with the overhead press and the snatch was 0.66 and clean and jerk was 0.7. So these are strong correlations. You could argue that one of the snatch is more moderate to strong, but these are strong correlations when it comes to the bench press. And so again, it doesn't mean one's driving the other. It just means that there's a relationship there. And coercion doesn't mean causation, of course. But what is interesting is, a lot of times we say, well, I've seen, some weightlifters devalue accessory work. I think most realize the value in it. And a lot of times that comes into play. I see this like with the Chinese weightlifting team, like when they do all these these guys are jacked, they're doing bodybuilding. It's like, what? Okay, of course they are. I mean, they lift weights. They're weightlifters. We should be doing this. Against this idea of obsessing with technique so much that we forget what the sport is fundamentally about. It's about lifting more weight. The technique exists not for scoring. Like when I get new weightlifters that are like, wow, how was that? Or does that count? If their technique was a little off, lost their balance in the jerk when they finished, or, they powered it instead of went to of course it counts, right? Remember, the whole goal here is to put the weight over your head without, having a break in movement or having a rebend or something in the elbow. It's not about technique. Now, the technique exists in order to move the bar efficiently. Okay, the technique does not exist as a scoring system. So we have to keep that in mind, that getting stronger does matter. And I just found this study interesting. We're looking at something that seems very non-specific, like the bench press, and certainly something more specific like the overhead press. And what was the actual relationship between these two exercises to the actual snatch and clean and jerk? So in the correlation values appear to be, not surprisingly, at least to me, strong. Okay. What else is strong or interesting to me is when you look at the data plotted. Okay. When you look at the data plotted against the front squat, the overhead press, the correlate, of course, there's a linear relationship there, but the slope is not as steep, which would support this idea that it's not as strong a correlation as the other exercise, bench press. But it shows you over time that even the heavier lifters had heavier overhead pressing. Okay, at least the relationship was there. That the heavier, there's a guy who was apparently hitting a clean and jerk about 180 kilos in this, and his front press was 90 kilo. So that's kind of nice to know. That there tends to be a relationship here of 180 kilos. You got to be front. Maybe not have to be, but a 90 kilo over strict press is about right. Right. I think it would be a little higher, but it wasn't. Okay. In the bench, there was an interesting relationship that the correlation values, and this makes me a little bit again, if you draw the line here, you can make this correlation work, but it's just interesting how the correlation is still this high. But I think the data, the plotting the data is what's really interesting. Up to body weight, which it appears most of these athletes stopped, they didn't achieve any load over a little bit over their body weight. So 100 kilos, it looked like was the bench press, is where it flattened. So there was this nice increase as the clean and jerk numbers got bigger. The bench press numbers also increased to around about 100 kilos on the bench. And then the clean and jerk numbers and the snatch numbers increased without any increase in the bench. So what could that mean? How does that look in training? If you trust these numbers, what could that mean? Well, once you clear body weight in the bench press, and maybe you could safely say, I'm going to just put some parameters on this, 20 kilos over body weight in the bench, maybe it doesn't matter anymore. So what does that mean? Well, the bench is an accessory lift, right? Does it matter? Yeah, it appears to matter, especially when an athlete isn't as strong, not surprisingly, right? But as they gain strength, it may not be as important again. I'm reading all that into this data, so you can just say, you're full of crap. I don't think that what you're saying is true. Fine, that's fine. But I'm just reading this data in from my own experience and thinking about the research of Anatoly Bondarchuk, right? Of, these correlation values over time, they're strong, like to strength, squat, and throwing, distance are stronger correlations. I won't say they're strong correlations, but they're strong. But over time, they get weaker. What does that mean? Well, there's other factors that are more important than that person's strength because they've achieved 2.5 body weight squat. They've achieved 3x body weight squat, right? It doesn't really matter then that they get 3.5 times body weight squat. That'd be crazy. But 3.5 times body weight squat because that's not what's holding them back anymore. There's other things, technical proficiency, mindset, speed of movement, whatever it may be, rate of force development, so on and so forth. That is, they're in play here. So I think this relationship is interesting though. And the application of this study then, support is nothing new again, but I think it's cool to see this affirmed is overhead strict pressing is important. It's important to a weightlifter. At least in terms of this relationship here, correlation, not causation, it appears to be important to a weightlifter. Okay, and I would say that I support that in the other research I've read and just some experience. Okay, I think that most athletes, put a bar overhead. There is some. Now, is it vitally important? Well, I mean, if you go by these correlation numbers, roughly 30% of the relationship is, roughly 30% of the value in the clean and jerk and snatch could be attributed to, I don't think it's probably that high, but attributed to the overhead press. I don't think it's directly attributed. In the bench, right? If the correlation values are that high, 0.8, you're looking at, 60%. I don't think it's quite that high. I question a little bit when I look at the plotting here of how the correlation was calculated. But the point is that these accessory movements matter, and they really matter to a point. And that, I think this study that's why it probably popped out to me, even though it's not the most perfect and beautifully done study, it kind of maybe reaffirmed my biases. How's that? Is that, these accessory lifts matter, and they matter early. If you're dealing with young athletes or in training age even, get all their numbers up across the board, their bent row, their overhead press, all these different accessory exercises. They're so important. The old Russian scheme, granted they were on PEDs and everything else, but they would go to this wide grouping of exercises early on and then start to pare down the more specific exercises they got closer to a season. That's their general strength conditioning approach, and even the weightlifting, right? In other words, it was build the whole body. Again, I think about the Chinese men, especially the men's Chinese weightlifting, people ooh and ah at how jacked these guys are. And it's like, well, that's how they should look, like they're weightlifters, right? That's how they should. I've noticed this as an observation, is most of the successful female lifters, one of the distinguishing qualities between an elite female lifter and a non-elite female lifter who may have commensurate lower body strength is their upper bodies, their upper body size, upper body strength. Okay, and it's like, well, they're weightlifters. Why would that matter? Because you still have to hold a bar, move a bar, strut a bar, right? Brace a bar. All these different things still have to happen, and so developing overall strength and musculature is important. All right. I'll leave it at that. Again, I'm not saying the study's perfect. If you go look at it, you're like, man, there's so many holes in this. I agree. There's a lot of holes in this, but I just thought it was a really interesting study, especially when you're looking at the data plotting and how the data looked over time in relation to the bench and the front and the overhead press. One is maybe up to a point is important, and then maybe not as important, and the other one is important potentially for the long haul for an athlete. Again, thinking that knowing that these are correlations and not, right? We're not talking about causation. I still think the relationships are interesting. Okay. See you in the next video.